First off, people's primary impression of you is not the same as their first impression of you. Their primary impression is how they see you by default or most of the time. For example, Nina might primarily be a happy and funny person, but she's not happy and funny all the time. So when John gets a text from Nina out of the blue, he's likely to use his primary impression of Nina to interpret that text. If Nina isn't aware of that, and her text doesn't make it clear that she's not trying to be funny, John might interpret an angry text from Nina as a joke.
What we've got here is failure to communicate.
Knowing what someone else's primary impression of us is will be very helpful both for our ability to communicate without misunderstandings and to connect with them deeply. Because when we know someone else's primary impression of us, we'll better know how to communicate with them, and if their primary impression of us is incorrect, we can work to change it, or at the very least ensure that it doesn't lead to any misunderstandings.
Everything we know about you guys is wrong.
Let's say, for example, that Mike meets Mona at a business conference. Since he's working and maybe there with his boss, Mike acts professional and very proper through most of their interactions. So by the end of the conference, Mona's primary impression of Mike is that he's a professional and proper guy. But really, as soon as his work clothes come off, Mike is a hedonistic nudist who just loves to party. And then, a few minutes later, Mike is hosting a party at his house and decides to invite Mona since there's going to be people there that he figures she wants to meet. Well, if Mike isn't aware of how Mona's primary impression of him differs from what he's like privately, Mona might be in for quite the shock when she shows up to the party and Mike is running around with no pants on. If he is aware of her primary impression, however, he can give her a warning when he extends the invitation by simply telling her what kind of party, people, and atmosphere there will be at this party. From that simple information, Mona can make an informed choice about whether or not she wants to go and be prepared to change her primary impression of Mike when she gets to see him in a different setting. The tricky thing about primary impressions is that other people's primary impression of us can be different from how we see ourselves and even different from how we imagine that they see us based on our time together. So in order to get it right, we have to put our ideas about how we want others to see us aside and try to discover how they actually see us. And we can do this in two ways. One, by observing how they treat us and inferring their primary impression of us from there, or the more reliable way, by asking. But remember, when we ask someone about how they see us or what their impression of us is, most people will tend to come up with a flattering answer that might not always be 100% truthful.
You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth.
To combat this, it will help if you give a little context for why you're asking, something that encourages them to answer you honestly. An example might be to tell them that you're studying communication these days or working on a project, and it would be very helpful if they could tell you their honest impression of you. Some will still chicken out a little and give a superficial and overly nice answer, but you'll likely get closer to the truth if you provide such a reason for why you're asking them.
And I can't deny the fact that you like me. Right now, you like me.
It's also important to remember that someone's primary impression of us isn't necessarily the only way they see us. It's just their default way of seeing us. It's how they see us when our behavior or the situation we're in doesn't make them aware that we aren't in that primary state right now. So the better someone knows you, the more situation, moods, and states they've seen you in, the more varied their understanding of your various sides will be, and the primary impression will matter less. In other words, the better someone knows you, the less influential their primary impression will be, simply because they know you well enough to adapt their interpretation of you in the moment. But people who don't know you well, or who only know you from a very limited amount of settings, will often have a very influential primary impression of you. And if you know what that is, you'll have a much easier time deepening your bond with them, or at the very least avoiding those misunderstandings that come as a result of them interpreting your words differently than what you meant.
Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth?
Does that make sense? Let me know in the comments below if you have any questions at all, or if you have any experiences with primary impressions that might be helpful or fun for others to hear about.